I've always loved babysitting. The extra cash, the sense of responsibility, and the sweet little kids, it all seemed perfect. But after what happened last summer, I'm not so sure anymore. My name is Rachel, and this is my story. It was a warm July evening when I got a call from Mrs. Peterson, a regular client of mine. She needed someone to watch her 2 kids, Emma and Lucas, while she and her husband went out for a much-needed date night. I had babysat for them a few times before, and it was always an easy gig. The kids were sweet, and the house was comfortable. I arrived at their house around 6 p.m. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden hue over the neighborhood. Mrs. Peterson greeted me at the door with a warm smile. "Thanks for coming on such short notice, Rachel. We really appreciate it." "No problem at all, Mrs. Peterson. You two go enjoy your evening. I've got everything under control here." Emma and Lucas were already in their pajamas, playing in the living room. Emma, a bright-eyed 7-year-old, was deeply engrossed in her coloring book, while Lucas, a 5-year-old with an infectious laugh, was building a tower with his Lego blocks. Mrs. Peterson quickly ran through the usual instructions: bedtime at 8 p.m., snacks in the fridge, emergency numbers by the phone, and then they were off. The house felt peaceful, and I settled into my routine, making sure the kids had their dinner and brushing up on a bedtime story. By 8:30 p.m., both kids were tucked into bed, and the house was eerily quiet. I plopped down on the couch ready to binge-watch some Netflix. As I was scrolling through the options, I heard a faint noise coming from upstairs. It was a soft, rhythmic creaking, like footsteps on an old wooden floor. I paused the show and listened intently. The house was old, and it did make noises, but this felt different. The creaking grew louder, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Grabbing my phone, I turned on the flashlight and headed up the stairs. "Emma? Lucas? Are you guys out of bed?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No response. I peeked into their rooms and both kids were sound asleep. The creaking had stopped, and I wondered if I had imagined it. I headed back downstairs, convincing myself it was just the house settling. Back on the couch, I tried to shake off the unease and focused on my show. About 20 minutes later, the noise started again. This time it was louder and more distinct. It wasn't just creaking. It sounded like someone was moving furniture upstairs. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed a kitchen knife for protection and cautiously made my way back up the stairs. The hallway was dark, and the only light came from the small nightlight in the kids' bathroom. The sound was coming from the attic. I had never been up to the Petersons' attic before. The entrance was a small square door in the ceiling of the hallway, with a pull-down ladder. Gathering all my courage, I reached up and pulled the ladder down, wincing as it creaked loudly. "Hello? Is anyone up there?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no answer. I climbed the ladder slowly, the knife clutched tightly in my hand. The attic was pitch black, and the beam of my flashlight barely pierced the darkness. As I stepped onto the attic floor, the smell of dust and old wood filled my nose. I scanned the room, expecting to see a raccoon, or maybe some old furniture that had shifted, but what I saw made my blood run cold. In the corner of the attic, there was an old rocking chair, and it was rocking back and forth, slowly, on its own. I froze, unable to move or even breathe. The chair creaked with each movement, as if someone invisible was sitting in it. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was the wind. But there were no windows in the attic, and no breeze. Gathering every ounce of courage, I approached the chair. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The rocking stopped abruptly and the attic fell silent. I took a step back, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure whoever or whatever was there could hear it. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind blew past me, making the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The temperature in the attic seemed to drop several degrees in an instant. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted down the ladder, nearly tripping in my haste, and slammed the attic door shut. I ran back to the kids' rooms to make sure they were okay. Both Emma and Lucas were still sound asleep, oblivious to the terror I was experiencing. I locked myself in the living room, knife still in hand, and called Mrs. Peterson. "Mrs. Peterson, I'm really sorry to bother you, but I think there's something in the attic. I don't know what it is, but it's really scaring me." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Mrs. Peterson responded. "Rachel, calm down. There's nothing in the attic. It's probably just the house settling. We've never had any issues before." Her words didn't reassure me, but I didn't want to sound paranoid. "Okay, I'll try to stay calm. Just please come home soon." After hanging up, I sat on the couch, every noise in the house magnified by my fear. The minutes felt like hours, and I kept glancing at the clock, willing the Petersons to come home. Finally, around midnight, I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Relief washed over me as I saw the headlights through the window. Mrs. and Mr. Peterson walked in, cheerful and laughing, their evening clearly a success. "Rachel, are you okay?" Mrs. Peterson asked, noticing my pale face and the knife still clutched in my hand. "I'm sorry, I heard noises and saw the rocking chair moving in the attic. It really freaked me out." Mrs. Peterson's expression softened. "Oh, Rachel, I'm so sorry. I should have told you about the chair. It belonged to my grandmother. She passed away in that chair, and sometimes it rocks by itself. We've gotten used to it, but I can see how it would be terrifying if you didn't know." I felt a mixture of relief and lingering fear. "So it's her ghost?" "We don't know for sure," Mrs. Peterson said gently, "but we've never felt threatened by it. I'm really sorry I didn't mention it." I nodded, feeling a bit foolish but also validated. "I understand. I'm just glad it's nothing dangerous." They paid me extra for the night and thanked me profusely. As I left, I couldn't shake the image of the rocking chair out of my mind. I had always been a skeptic when it came to the supernatural, but that night changed everything. From that day on, I decided to be more careful about the houses I babysat in. Sometimes it's not just the kids you have to worry about, it's the unseen guests that share the space. And every now and then, when I'm home alone, I still hear that faint creaking sound, and I wonder if Mrs. Peterson's grandmother has come to visit me too. My name is Jessica, and this is the story of the night I will never forget. It all started when I agreed to babysit for the Millers, a family new to our neighborhood. They had recently moved into a large, old house at the edge of town, the kind of house that looks charming in the daylight, but downright eerie at night. I arrived at their house around 7 p.m. Mrs. Miller greeted me warmly and introduced me to her kids, Hannah and Max. Hannah was 8, with a curious nature and a love for storytelling, while Max was 6 and shy, always clinging to his sister. "We'll be back by midnight," Mrs. Miller said. "There's dinner in the fridge and the kids' bedtime is at 9 p.m. Thank you so much for doing this on such short notice." "No problem at all," I replied with a smile, although the house gave me an uneasy feeling. The evening went smoothly at first. We had dinner, played some board games, and I even managed to get both kids into bed on time. As I tucked them in, Hannah asked, "Jessica, have you ever heard the walls whisper?" I laughed nervously. "No, I haven't. Why do you ask?" "Sometimes at night I hear whispers. Max hears them too," she said, her eyes wide with innocence and fear. "It's probably just the wind," I said, trying to reassure her. "Now go to sleep. Your parents will be back soon." I turned off the lights and went back downstairs to relax. I tried to distract myself with a book, but I couldn't shake off what Hannah had said. The house was old, and old houses make noises, I told myself. Around 10 p.m., as I was about to doze off on the couch, I heard it. A faint whispering sound. It was so soft at first that I thought I was imagining it. But then it grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from the walls. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hello? Is someone there?" I called out, but only silence answered me. The whispering resumed, and it seemed to be moving through the house. I followed the sound, my curiosity battling with my fear. It led me to the hallway outside Hannah and Max's room. The whispers were clearer now, like voices speaking in hushed tones, but I couldn't make out any words. Gathering my courage, I pressed my ear against the wall. The cold surface sent a shiver down my spine. The whispers were louder now, almost as if they were inside the wall itself. I knocked lightly, hoping to disrupt whatever was making the noise. The whispering stopped abruptly. I took a step back, trying to catch my breath. Suddenly, Max's door creaked open, and he stood there looking terrified. "Jessica, are they back?" "Who, Max?" I asked, my voice shaking. "The people in the walls," he whispered, his eyes filling with tears. I scooped him up and carried him back to his room, tucking him in and trying to calm him down. "It's okay, Max. It's just the house. Old houses make noises." "But it sounds like they're talking," he insisted, clutching his blanket. "I know, but there's nothing to be afraid of," I lied, feeling anything but brave. I stayed with the kids until they fell asleep, the whispering now a constant, unnerving presence. I went back downstairs, my mind racing. I needed to understand what was happening, but I was too scared to confront it directly. Just before midnight, I heard the front door open. The Millers were home. Mrs. Miller looked surprised to see me looking so distressed. "Jessica, is everything all right?" I hesitated, not wanting to sound crazy. I heard noises, whispering from the walls. Mrs. Miller's face grew pale. "We heard the same thing our first night here. We thought it was just our imagination, but now, I'm not so sure." Mr. Miller joined us, his expression serious. "We've been meaning to get the house checked out, but we didn't want to scare the kids. Thank you for telling us, Jessica. We'll look into it." I left the Miller's house that night with a sense of unease that I couldn't shake off. They promised to call a specialist to inspect the house, but I never heard from them again. A few weeks later, a for sale sign appeared on their lawn. To this day, I still wonder what was behind those whispering walls. Whatever it was, I hope the next family who moves in never has to find out. I'm Emma, and I've been babysitting for years. Nothing had ever scared me until I spent a night at the old Richardson house. It was a creaky, Victorian-era mansion on the outskirts of town, the kind of place that had a history, and not all of it pleasant. Mrs. Richardson called me one evening, asking if I could watch their son, Oliver, while they went to a work function. Oliver was 7, a quiet and polite kid. I'd babysat him a couple of times before without any issues, so I agreed. I arrived at their house at 6:30 p.m. Mrs. Richardson greeted me with a frazzled smile. "Thank you so much for coming on such short notice, Emma. We should be back by midnight. Oliver has already had his dinner, and he can stay up until 8 p.m. "Sure, no problem. Have a great time," I replied, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling that crept over me as I stepped inside the house. Oliver was in the living room, playing with his toy soldiers. He looked up and gave me a shy smile. "Hi, Emma." "Hey, Oliver. What are we playing tonight?" I asked, trying to sound cheerful. "Can we play hide and seek?" he asked. "Of course," I said, relieved. Hide and seek was a harmless, fun game, or so I thought. We started our game, and everything was normal at first. I counted while Oliver hid. Then it was my turn to hide. I found a good spot behind the thick curtains in the dining room. The house was quiet, except for the faint ticking of an old grandfather clock in the hallway. As I waited for Oliver to find me, I started to hear whispers. They were soft, almost inaudible at first, but they grew louder. It sounded like multiple voices all speaking at once, but I couldn't make out any words. "Oliver?" I called out, stepping out from behind the curtains. "Is that you?" There was no answer. I checked the living room, but Oliver wasn't there. The whispers continued, now coming from the direction of the basement. The basement door was slightly ajar, a faint light spilling out from below. "Oliver, this isn't funny," I said, my voice trembling as I approached the door. I slowly opened it and peered down the dark staircase. The whispers were louder now, echoing up from the depths. Gathering my courage, I descended the stairs. The basement was cold and musty, filled with old furniture covered in white sheets. In the corner, I saw Oliver, standing perfectly still, staring at the far wall. "Oliver, what are you doing down here?" I asked, rushing to his side. He turned to me, his face pale. "They told me to come here," he whispered. "Who told you?" I asked, but before he could answer, a chilling breeze swept through the basement and the whispers intensified. I grabbed Oliver's hand and pulled him towards the stairs. "We need to get out of here." As we climbed the stairs, the door slammed shut, plunging us into darkness. I fumbled for the light switch, my heart pounding. The whispers were all around us now, like a cacophony of ghostly voices. "Emma, I'm scared," Oliver said, his grip tightening on my hand. "It's okay, Oliver. We're getting out of here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Finally, I found the switch, and the basement light flickered on. We raced up the stairs and into the hallway. The house was eerily silent again. I quickly locked the basement door and led Oliver back to the living room. We sat on the couch, both of us shaking. I checked the time. It was only 9 p.m. Mrs. Richardson wouldn't be back for another 3 hours. I decided to call them and ask them to come home early. "Mrs. Richardson, I'm sorry to bother you, but something strange is happening. I think you should come home," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "What's wrong, Emma?" she asked, sounding concerned. "There are voices in the house, whispering. Oliver heard them too." There was a long pause. "Emma, I didn't want to scare you, but we've had issues with this house before. We think it's haunted. That's why we're planning to move." My blood ran cold. Haunted. Yes, we've heard the whispers too. We've even seen things move on their own. But it's never harmed us. I'm so sorry, Emma. We should have told you. I hung up, feeling a mix of fear and anger. I decided we couldn't stay in the house any longer. I grabbed our coats and took Oliver outside to wait on the porch. The night was cool and calm, a stark contrast to the terror inside. Mrs. and Mr. Richardson arrived shortly after, their faces etched with worry. "Emma, I'm so sorry," Mrs. Richardson said, hugging Oliver tightly. "It's okay. I think you should get someone to look at the house," I said, still shaken. "We will," Mr. Richardson promised. "Thank you for taking care of Oliver." I left the Richardson house that night, my heart still racing. I had always been skeptical about ghosts and haunted houses, but that night changed everything. Sometimes, the scariest stories are the ones that are true. From that day on, I was more careful about the places I babysat, and whenever I heard a whisper in the dark, I couldn't help but think of that old house and the secrets it held.